I felt his breath hitch when the fabric of my dress lifted just a little higher. He's 55. My stepfather. He never allowed himself to slip. But tonight, I saw something breaking inside him. Rylan had always been the perfect husband to my mother. Reserved, composed, always in control. But I knew the truth. I saw the way his gaze lingered on me longer than necessary. The way he swallowed hard when I walked past in short shorts. And tonight, I decided it was time to push him over the edge. I stepped into the dimly lit living room. Just a thin red dress clinging to my body like a second skin. Too tight, too short, too inappropriate for home. He was on the couch, papers in his hands. His eyes skimmed the pages, but I knew the moment he sensed me. His fingers tightened ever so slightly. I moved slowly, deliberately. Every step measured. His breath had changed. I could hear it, feel it. I sat across from him, crossing my legs with excruciating slowness. His gaze dropped reflexively, then darted away. But it was too late. He had already lost. Earlier that day, I had spent hours in my room, deciding what to wear. Something that wouldn't just tempt him, but unravel him. The dress had been a deliberate choice. A whisper of silk against bare skin. Red, bold, dangerous, the color of control slipping through trembling fingers. I made sure to leave my door slightly open as I got ready. I knew he'd pass by. I wanted him to see, to catch a glimpse and then hate himself for looking. And he did. I heard his footsteps in the hallway. Slow, hesitant, then a pause, just a second too long. That second told me everything. I smiled at my reflection. Tonight, he would break. Back in the living room, I shifted slightly, pretending to adjust the hem of my dress. It lifted a fraction higher. Rylan turned a page in his file, but he wasn't reading. His hands were tense, his jaw locked. "Long day?" I asked, my voice smooth, effortless. He exhaled slowly. "Yeah." I tilted my head, studying him. The tension in his shoulders. The way he refused to meet my eyes. "You work too much," I murmured. "Maybe you need to unwind." His fingers twitched. He finally glanced at me, just a flicker, but the heat in his gaze betrayed him. I pressed on. "Mom's working late again, right?" Silence. A flicker of something dark flashed across his face before he masked it with indifference. "Yes." I leaned back, stretching lazily. The movement pulled the fabric of my dress tighter against me. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrest. My heart pounded. He was trying so hard to pretend this wasn't happening. I decided to push a little further. I rose from my seat and walked past him, close enough that the faint scent of my perfume lingered in the air between us. I could almost feel the battle raging inside him. I reached for the wine bottle on the counter, taking my time pouring a glass. I knew he was watching. When I turned back, his gaze snapped away too quickly. "Want some?" I asked, holding up the glass. His throat worked as he swallowed. "No." I smirked. "Suit yourself." I took a slow sip, letting the moment stretch. Then, deliberately, I let a single drop of wine slip from my lips, trailing down my neck. His breath hitched. His restraint cracked. For the first time, I saw it, the war between guilt and desire. He wanted to leave. He should leave. But he didn't. He stayed. And that was his first mistake. I placed the glass down and walked past him again, this time grazing his shoulder as I passed. The warmth of his skin beneath his shirt sent a shiver through me. I lingered for a second, waiting. His breathing had changed again. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see him in my peripheral vision. His hands were clenched into fists. Good. I didn't need to win this battle tonight. I just needed to make sure he lost the next one. And he would. Because the way he was looking at me now, he already had. The next morning, I acted as if nothing had happened. The house was quiet, just the distant hum of the coffee machine filling the air as I moved through the kitchen. I wore a thin robe, loosely tied at the waist, letting it slide just enough to test how much he would notice. I knew he was there before I even turned around. Rylan sat at the dining table, pretending to scroll through his phone, but I caught it, the briefest flicker of his gaze as it traced the curve of my leg. He didn't say a word, didn't acknowledge my presence beyond a short glance, but that was enough. He saw. I poured my coffee slowly, deliberately, letting the sound of liquid filling the cup stretch between us. I could feel his tension, the stiffness in his posture, the way he forced himself to focus on anything but me. "Long night?" My voice was casual, almost lazy, as I leaned against the counter, taking a slow sip. His jaw tightened. "Fine." I smirked behind my cup. He didn't even ask about my night. He left a few minutes later, the door closing a little harder than necessary. I exhaled, savoring the small victory. He was unraveling. That evening, I found him in the living room, watching something on TV that he clearly wasn't interested in. His attention drifted, his fingers tapping idly against the armrest. I walked in, curling up onto the couch next to him. Not too close, but close enough. The silence between us stretched. The air felt heavier than before. Bored? I murmured, reaching for the remote. Our hands brushed, just for a second, and I felt his muscles tense. He didn't pull away. I let the moment linger. I knew he was waiting for me to move first, to create some distance. But I didn't. The next move was his. He shifted, exhaling slowly before getting up. I should go to bed. I didn't stop him. I didn't need to, because I knew what I was about to do next. I left my bedroom door slightly open that night. I wasn't asleep. I was waiting. I sat by my mirror, pretending to fix my hair, wearing nothing but a thin silk slip that clung to my skin. The kind of thing a girl only wears when she wants to be seen. I heard his footsteps in the hallway. Slower this time. Hesitant. Then, he stopped. I kept my movements natural, running my fingers through my hair, letting the fabric slide against my body as I shifted slightly. I could almost feel his gaze burning through the crack in the door. Then, just as quickly, he was gone. I waited a few seconds before turning to the mirror. My pulse was racing. He had stopped, but not before looking. The next day, something had changed. He avoided me, barely spoke, barely looked in my direction. He spent most of the day in his office, doors closed, as if trying to drown himself in work. I let him, because I knew this wasn't him winning. It was him running, and he wouldn't be able to run forever. That night, I found him in the kitchen. He was standing by the fridge, drinking water, when I stepped in. The thin fabric of my tank top was almost translucent under the soft kitchen light. I wasn't wearing a bra. His grip on the glass tightened. "Can't sleep?" His voice was rougher than usual. I shook my head. "Too warm." He didn't respond, but I saw his jaw clench. I stepped closer, close enough that I could feel the heat from his body. The tension between us crackled like static. And then, I did something reckless. I reached out and touched his arm. Just lightly. Just enough to feel how tight his muscles were beneath my fingertips. He didn't move, didn't pull away. But he wasn't breathing either. I held his gaze, daring him to say something, to do something. He didn't. So I smiled, turned away, and walked back to my room. When I glanced at the hallway mirror, I saw it. Him. Standing in the darkness. Watching me. This wasn't a game anymore. The next evening, the tension was unbearable. I felt it in every glance, every word left unspoken. He was unraveling. I tested him again, pushing just a little further. I left my book on the couch beside him, knowing I'd have to lean over to grab it, knowing exactly how my body would press against his side. When I reached for it, my fingers brushed against his knee. He stiffened. My heart pounded. For a split second, I thought he might grab my wrist, stop me, say something. But he didn't. He exhaled sharply, then stood. "What are you doing, Savannah?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was something underneath it. Rylan had been avoiding me all day. He left early in the morning, returned late, and locked himself in his office the moment he stepped inside. The air in the house had changed, thick, charged, humming with something unspoken. I could feel it every time I passed his closed door, every time I moved through the spaces he carefully avoided. But I knew he couldn't hide forever. By nightfall, I found him in the kitchen. The light from the stove cast a dim glow over the room, shadows stretching across the tiled floor. He stood by the counter, pouring a glass of water, his shoulders tense, his back rigid. He must have heard me enter, but he didn't turn around. He was pretending I wasn't there. I leaned against the fridge, watching him. He was trying too hard to seem unaffected, to act like my presence meant nothing. But the way his grip tightened around that glass told me otherwise. "Can't sleep?" My voice was soft, knowing. I saw the flicker in his eyes as he finally turned his head, meeting my gaze for the first time since last night. His expression was unreadable, carefully controlled, but I noticed the way his fingers twitched against the glass. "It's late, Savannah," he muttered, voice rougher than usual. I took a slow step forward, letting my bare feet glide across the cold floor, closing the space between us. "I know." My fingers brushed against his forearm, just the lightest touch. His muscles tensed beneath my fingertips. He didn't move away, but he didn't look at me either. The air between us was heavy, suffocating. The silence stretched, thick with something unsaid. I tilted my head, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you avoiding me?" His jaw tightened. He set the glass down carefully, but his movements were too deliberate, too controlled. "Go to bed," he said, but the words lacked conviction. I smiled, slow and knowing. "If I didn't know any better, I'd think you were afraid of me." His breath hitched, just slightly, just enough for me to catch it. His restraint was slipping. Then, before I could push any further, he turned and walked out, disappearing down the hallway without another word. I exhaled, feeling the rush of victory crawl through me. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Later that night, I stepped out onto the terrace. The air was cool against my skin, carrying the distant scent of rain. The house was silent, the world outside dark and still. I knew he was out there before I saw him. Ryland stood near the railing, hands braced against the metal, staring into the night as if the darkness held the answers he was searching for. His posture was rigid, controlled, but there was tension in the way his fingers curled around the railing, in the way his breath came too slowly. I walked past him, close enough that my shoulder brushed against his arm. I felt the sharp inhale he took, the way his body reacted before his mind could stop it. I didn't look at him. I didn't stop, but I knew he was watching. I lingered by the edge of the terrace, letting the silence stretch between us, my fingers tracing idle patterns on the cold surface of the railing. I could feel his gaze burning into my back, heavy, conflicted, torn between what was right and what he wanted. "Why are you out here?" His voice was quieter this time, less certain. I glanced over my shoulder, meeting his eyes. Couldn't sleep. Something passed between us then, something dangerous and unspoken. A pull neither of us acknowledged, but neither of us moved away from. A line neither of us should cross. And yet, neither of us stepped back. I turned first, walking back inside. I didn't have to look to know he was still watching, because when I reached my room and glanced at the mirror, I saw him, standing in the darkness of the hallway, staring. This wasn't a game anymore. The next day, everything seemed normal. Or at least, he wanted it to seem that way. Ryland kept himself occupied, moving around the house with rigid precision, avoiding eye contact. His voice clipped when he spoke. He left early, returned late, and when he did, he went straight to his office, the door closing with quiet finality behind him. I didn't push. Not yet. The tension hadn't gone away, it had settled deeper, simmering beneath the surface. It was in the way he clenched his jaw at breakfast, the way his hands flexed before he shoved them into his pockets. I could feel it when I walked past him, the way his body stiffened, as if he had to remind himself not to react. But the more he tried to suppress it, the more obvious it became. That night, the house was quiet, my mother still gone for work. Just him and me, alone again. I found him in the living room, sitting in the armchair, his posture controlled, almost defensive. His arms were folded across his chest, his expression unreadable. But I could feel it, the storm brewing beneath the surface. I walked in without hesitation, carrying a glass of wine, my movements slow, deliberate. He was watching me before he even realized he was. His gaze flickered down, just for a second, before he forced himself to look away. I smiled to myself. "What are you doing, Savannah?" His voice was low, steady, but I could hear the roughness beneath it, the restraint stretched thin. I took a slow sip of wine, letting the silence stretch between us. "What if I'm doing nothing?" His jaw tightened. "This needs to stop." I tilted my head, studying him. "I don't know what you mean." His eyes darkened. "Yes, you do." I stepped closer, watching his reaction, testing the boundary I knew was already cracking. He stayed still, his breath controlled, his muscles tight with restraint. But he didn't move away. "Why are you so tense?" My voice was soft, almost teasing. I ran a finger along the rim of my glass, watching his expression shift, small, barely noticeable, but there. A flicker of something he didn't want to acknowledge. He exhaled sharply. "Go to bed, Savannah." I smirked. "I'm not tired." Something in his posture shifted, an invisible crack spreading beneath his carefully placed walls. I moved again, closer this time, my bare feet soundless against the floor. The heat between us felt tangible, electric. His body was still, but his eyes followed every movement. And then, suddenly, his hand shot out, fingers wrapping around my wrist, stopping me in place. It wasn't rough, it wasn't harsh, but it was firm. His grip was warm, steady, his palm pressing against my skin, his pulse just beneath the surface. I could feel the tension in his fingers, the war inside him. His eyes met mine, dark and unreadable. Enough. The word came out low, controlled, but something about it sent a thrill through me. Not a demand. Not an order. A warning. I lifted my chin slightly. "You don't sound very convincing." His grip on my wrist tightened just for a fraction of a second before he let go and pushed himself out of the chair. He turned his back to me, running a hand over his face. I saw the rise and fall of his chest, the way his shoulders tensed, the way he was forcing himself to breathe evenly. "You should stop playing games," he muttered. I took another sip of wine. "What if I'm not playing?" He turned then, slowly, his expression unreadable, but his eyes burning with something undeniable. "Then that's a problem." The silence stretched between us, heavy, suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat, the anticipation crackling in the air. Then, without another word, he left. I stood there for a moment, the echo of his presence lingering in the room. I let my fingers brush over the place on my wrist where he had held me, where his warmth still lingered. He was breaking. And he knew it. But the most dangerous part? He wasn't sure if he wanted to stop it. The night air was thick with warmth, heavy with the scent of water and jasmine. The pool shimmered under the dim glow of the outdoor lights, its surface smooth, undisturbed, unlike me. I ran my fingers through the water absent-mindedly, my reflection warping beneath the ripples. I had been waiting for this moment, anticipating it. But now that it was here, I wasn't sure why I had wanted it so badly. I heard his footsteps before I saw him. Slow, measured, reluctant. I kept my back turned, letting the silence stretch between us. Usually, I would have let it coil tighter, turn heavier, make the air thick with something unsaid. But tonight, the weight pressing down on me felt different. When I finally looked up, he was standing at the edge of the pool, his face in shadow, but his presence unmistakable. He wasn't moving closer, just standing there, staring, like he was trying to decide something. He looked exhausted, not just physically, but in a way that settled deep into his bones. The tension in his shoulders, the stiffness in his stance, he was fighting something. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted him to lose. "Rylan," I said, my voice softer than I intended. His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "You shouldn't be out here." I tilted my head. "Neither should you." His jaw tightened. "Savannah, this," he exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. "I can't do this." I had expected that. I had expected the hesitation, the internal war raging behind his eyes. What I hadn't expected was the way it made my stomach twist uncomfortably. Usually, his resistance felt like a challenge, a wall meant to be broken. But now, it felt like something else, something I wasn't ready to name. "You keep saying that," I murmured, watching him closely. "But you're still here." He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head, his movements jerky, restless. "Because I keep trying to figure out where I lost control." A strange feeling crept up my spine. And, his gaze flickered to mine, something raw behind his eyes. Maybe I never had it to begin with. I should have felt victorious. I should have smiled, leaned into the moment, let it unravel the way I always did. But instead, a lump formed in my throat, because I knew exactly what he meant. I had thought I was in control of this, of him, of myself, of whatever this was. But standing there, under the dim glow of the night, I realized something terrifying. I wasn't. The pool water lapped softly against the tiles, the only sound between us. I dropped my gaze, feeling my own pulse in my throat. "Then why do you keep coming back?" His silence stretched. I could feel his answer before he spoke it. "Because I don't know how to walk away," he admitted, voice low, barely above a whisper. "And that scares me more than anything else." I swallowed hard. The words hung between us, heavy, suffocating. They should have been a victory, proof that I had won. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like something unraveling. I forced myself to hold his gaze, even though my chest felt tight, even though my hands curled into fists beneath the water. "Then maybe you should." His breath hitched. Just slightly. Just enough for me to catch it. His eyes locked onto mine, searching, trying to find something, maybe a reason to stay. Maybe a reason to go. For the first time, I wasn't sure which one I wanted him to choose. And that terrified me. The silence stretched. And then, finally, he nodded. He turned, taking a slow step back. Then another. And I didn't stop him. I sat there, unmoving, listening to his footsteps fade into the house. The water rippled around me, disturbed, shifting under the weight of something I couldn't name. I had spent so long pushing, playing, testing limits, his, mine. I had convinced myself I was the one pulling the strings, that I had the power, that I was in control. But sitting there, alone, staring at my reflection in the water, I realized the truth. I had never been in control. Not of him. Not of myself. And now, for the first time, I was afraid of what I had done. This wasn't a game. This had never been a game. And I had just made the biggest mistake of my life.